I want to start off our program tonight just by thanking the California Trade Justice Coalition and Global Exchange for co-hosting tonight's event. We are super grateful for their help. I'm really excited for tonight's premiere of this brand new documentary short called Critical Minerals: Creating a Just and Sustainable Clean Energy Transition. Just by way of an agenda for tonight's call, I'm going to pass the mic off in just a minute to Mira Rubio from the California Trade Justice Coalition, who is going to share some comments about the documentary. We're going to watch the documentary together, and then we'll hear a bit more from Mira before we turn to your questions. We do have some of our documentary participants here to help out with Q&A tonight, so there's other folks that you'll get the chance to hear from too. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature as we go. We're going to get to as many of those questions as we can toward the end of the call. So I want to turn quickly now to introducing Mira Rubio from the California Trade Justice Coalition. Mira is an up-and-coming leader in the trade justice movement, and she has done an incredible job putting this documentary together over the last several months. The documentary itself has already been accepted to a film festival, and Mira is nominated for a Youth Director Award, which is really exciting. I'm really pumped just to be part of sharing this documentary with you and excited for you to hear from Mira in her own words about the project. Mira.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mira Rubio, and I am the coordinator for the California Trade Justice Coalition, and I'm the director for the short documentary we'll all be watching in just a minute. So I firstly want to thank all of you for the opportunity to speak with you today and screen critical minerals, creating a just and sustainable clean energy transition. As the video will explain much more in depth, critical minerals are things like nickel, cobalt, and lithium that are used in electric vehicles, solar panels, long storage batteries, and other technologies that are necessary for the clean energy transition. And the US currently has a number of critical mineral trade agreements in the works, and the rules written into those agreements could have a big impact on whether critical mineral supply chains help and contribute to a just and sustainable energy transition or a really dirty and exploitative energy transition. And the path isn't set in stone yet, and it's something that we can very much still influence. So this video is about 12 minutes long, and rather than me summarizing it for you, let's just jump in and watch it, and then I will give a few updates with the latest on pending critical minerals trade agreements, and we can dig into questions or comments that you might have. And before we get started, I also want to thank our other wonderful panelists we have here who helped so much with creating this documentary. That is Jake, our amazing editor, Marianne, from Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, Arthur and Hillary as well. And we'll hear more from them after. But thank you so much, all of you, for being here and helping to support me with this.
I'm a researcher at Climate Rates International.
My name is Mira Rubio, and I am the coordinator for the California Trade Justice Coalition.
Hi, my name is Ileana Paul. I'm the Deputy Director of Sierra Club's Industrial Transformation Campaign.
My name is Maurice Carney. I'm one of the co-founders of Friends of the Congo.
My name is Marianne Comfort. I work for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas.
I wanted to firstly ask you, what are critical minerals and why are they so crucial for the clean energy transition?
So these include minerals like cobalt, nickel, lithium, copper, and they're used in a variety of renewable energy transition. So from renewable energies to building solar panels and windmills to building the transmission lines needed to get energy from point A to point B, and to build things like batteries that we need to harness electricity. So really, without these raw materials, they're a necessary piece in building out the actual infrastructure we need to decarbonize from fossil fuels.
Critical Critical minerals agreements, also known as CMAs, are targeted trade agreements that seek to strengthen critical mineral supply chains. So depending upon how they're written, critical minerals agreements can help countries meet shared climate, job creation, and sustainable development goals, or they can end up accelerating exploitative models of resource extraction that are harmful to workers, communities, and the environment.
So nickel is, a mineral used in electric vehicle batteries as well as for some other purposes. And Indonesia is the world's largest producer. Last year, it produced over 50% of the world's nickel, and its market share is increasing. And, local community members told us that their land had been taken by companies without their consent. In some cases, people's land had been destroyed by companies, leaving them with no option but to sell. They were no longer able to harvest food off their land once all those trees were cut. In some cases, members of the police or military came and intimidated people into selling their land. So for example, we had one person tell us that, the police would come to his door repeatedly at 2 a.m. to demand why he hadn't sold his land to a nickel company. In addition to, issues around land, one of the things that we've heard quite a bit around nickel is the impact on people's traditional livelihoods. So people who are traditionally sustain themselves and their families through farming or fishing are no longer able to do so because of either loss of their land or degradation of the natural environment. So both, nickel mining, nickel processing is really harmful in the environment if, proper protections are not taken.
One of the coordinators of miners, you have collectives that range in the tens of thousands of diggers, cobalt, copper diggers. We're just talking with him, and he held up this rock, and you can see the different layers and colors. And he said in this rock there are up to 7 different minerals you can find: manganese and copper and cobalt and tin and zinc, malachite. You just name it. And that's the sense. It gives you the sense of the spectacular wealth that is there. Or if you go on one of the main roads where the minerals are being shipped out, you can travel for up to 30 kilometers and you'll see trucks, just lines of trucks of minerals going out of the country. At the same time, with all of that spectacular wealth laying there under the ground, as you go into the communities, and you find that lack of access to water, potable water, clean water, lack of access to electricity, lack of access to basic internet. So you see the disparity between the tremendous wealth and then the living conditions, social conditions of people.
So we happen to have sisters in Argentina, and we hear from them often about the communities that are being harmed by lithium, which, in case you don't know how lithium is extracted there, is by evaporation. So these are very dry areas, and so any process that uses tons of water is very detrimental to diverting the water from the communities and from their livelihoods into this process of extracting the lithium. So that's a big concern. We know of lots of cases of environmental and land defenders who have been killed for resisting projects of all different kinds of mining, including for the energy transition.
Throughout international law, this is a standard practice that Indigenous peoples have the right to exercise free prior informed consent. So the right to get information, to decide whether or not to go it, and ultimately to say yes or no. Out of, we interviewed about 4 dozen people, impacted by nickel mining in Indonesia. Most of those people self-identified as Indigenous, which, people have the right to self-determination. Not a single person we interviewed was able to exercise that right to free prior informed consent. So broadly, across the world, something like 54% of all critical minerals mining projects are located on Indigenous peoples' lands. So Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by these projects. And that being said, they're not necessarily the ones who are benefiting from the minerals that are coming out of that ground.
They're still living in hell, right? They're not the primary beneficiaries. They are getting crumbs. If you take into consideration what the finished product is like. In fact, they complain and say, well, we produce these, this is where the minerals come from for the smartphones, the batteries in the smartphones. But we can't afford smartphones. We don't have a smartphone. So they are keenly aware they're not benefiting, and they, for all intents and purposes, living in poverty, extreme poverty, as well, in spite of the tremendous wealth that's around them. As these minerals are coming out, right, we find, according to the World Bank, up to 70 million or so Congolese live on less than $2.15 a day, of a 110 million population, in a country where economists say that there's $24 trillion worth of natural resources.
If trade rules are weak, they'll make it easier for big corporations to come in, extract minerals from one country with no restraint, ship them to another where they can be processed with essentially no regard to labor rights or wages, and then they can send the products back to the US for consumption. And that's essentially how the system exists right now. And there are so many opportunities along every step of this process that are just ripe for exploitation if we don't have the proper safeguards in place. And all we're saying is it doesn't have to be this way.
The only way that I know how to do it is to mandate it through government policies and regulations, because I don't think we can count on companies just doing it out of the goodwill. Maybe some companies would, but we can't count on that. We have to mandate it.
Any proposed critical minerals agreement, in order to be successful, needs to do three things. So firstly is prioritize, reduce, reuse, and recycling in the critical minerals supply chain instead of just new mining operations alone. Two, it needs to create good-paying jobs in the value chain industries in both the United States and the regions in which critical minerals are being extracted or recovered. And third, it needs to establish strong, binding standards on labor rights, the environment, indigenous rights, and community consent all throughout the supply chain. And it needs to be backed up by swift and certain enforcement mechanisms that will hold the companies accountable.
So circularity is basically reducing the use of virgin resources by transforming the cradle-to-grave cycle, where a once-used material ends up in landfills or incinerators, with basically a cradle-to-cradle cycle, where the same molecules show up again and again in both reused and newly made goods. So it's like amped up recycling. That's kind of a minimizing what circularity is, but I think for most people, that's what we can attach it to in our day-to-day. For critical minerals in particular, prioritizing circularity means that there's less lithium mining, less nickel mining, less cobalt mining, but still plenty of EV batteries, solar panels, and more.
Better equipment, implementation of policies that the government have in place, that they regulations and policies that they believe can benefit, and formalization of the mining sector. They seek support in terms of investment or loans. They believe that they can help them. Materials, protect them as they dig, and then just overall information.
Strong labor standards are needed to ensure that workers all along the supply chain have good-paying jobs, safe jobs where they're free from harassment, and that they can organize with the unions of their choosing. Meanwhile, strong environmental standards are needed to protect the surrounding community's air, water, and biodiversity.
So those of us who are privileged in the global north, are to be mobilizing to assure that human rights standards are met, labor standards are met, environmental standards are met in a way that would reflect what we demand in our backyards here in the United States, for example.
We can't let corporations whose only priority is shareholder value, or the politicians whose pockets they line, dictate how we power our homes and our businesses, how we make essential goods, and how we connect with and manage our lands and our water. So for critical minerals, it means that communities located in mining areas not only directly benefit from the mineral resource extraction, but they also get to shape what the extraction looks like. It means that workers building EV batteries are making family-supporting wages in stable union jobs. It means that once a battery has reached the end of its useful life, the individual components are extracted and made into new products. In order to get there, I think it's really essential that up and down the supply chain, there's a respect for human rights, for labor rights, for the integrity of our environment. The pessimist in me thinks that this will be a big undertaking, especially in the current political environment. So I think that civil society has to play a really big role in making sure there's transparency and accountability both of companies and of our governments. Our governments are here to represent us. They're supposed to be working in our favor, and it's really up to the people to kind of hold feet to the fire if we need to. But I do think that we need a really radically different path forward than the path that we've used to date for all sorts of resource extraction and in particular sort of the things that are traded around the world.
Even though thousands of miles away, say, what's happening in the Congo matters to me. What's happening in the Congo, I'm going to dedicate myself to assure that it's not normalized. Whether it's the tech workers in the UK that's formed a working group, or the workers in the semiconductor and chips industry in Silicon Valley who formed a working group around the Congo, saying that we have to do something. We cannot normalize this condition. The organizing on the ground, the solidarity outside of the Congo, even our having this exchange right now where I'm sharing with you our experiences in working with folks on the ground. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope.
So hopefully the video gave you a solid understanding on what critical minerals are and why they matter so much right now. At the moment, the US, specifically the Trump administration, is in trade talks with countries like Argentina, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and potentially Indonesia as well, amongst others. And these are countries that hold large reserves of critical minerals. And from their side, these governments just want to make sure that two things happen. Firstly, that their products like nickel, cobalt, and lithium, as we've talked about, can enter the US market without facing steep tariffs. And second, that their businesses can access US subsidies tied to green technologies and minerals. And that can mean a few things, like whether electric vehicle batteries made with their country's minerals qualify for consumer tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act, or whether mining companies can get their low interest loans from US development banks. And what we at the California Trade Justice Coalition and lots of others like Climate Rights International, the Sierra Club, and Friends of the Congo, and over 100 more other organizations are pushing for is this: that any new critical minerals deals need to prioritize labor protections, environmental standards, and human rights. So that means making sure circularity, which is, as we talked about, reusing, recycling, and reducing, is built into the supply chains from the start. And it also means creating real economic value, not just in the US, but in countries where these minerals come from. So we're not just extracting and leaving, but we're also building something more sustainable. And most importantly, it means requiring strong binding standards throughout the entire supply chain on labor rights, environmental protections, transparency, indigenous rights, and community consent. And those standards need real teeth, so real enforcement mechanisms and real consequences when companies break the rules. And the good news for us is that this isn't a pipe dream. So there are already efforts around the world to clean up mining, create better jobs, to give back to local communities, and to give local communities more control and more benefits. And because US deals often come with access to subsidies, we actually have a lot of power to shape what those deals can look like. But we can't let this happen behind closed doors with mining CEOs and corporate lobbyists at the table and workers, environmentalists, and indigenous communities left out. We need to make it clear to our officials that we're paying attention. So there are a few very specific but very simple asks that we have associated with this video, and all of which can be found on our website that was linked at the end of the video, called criticalmineralsjustice.org. So firstly, everyone as an individual can please sign the petition on that site calling for basic standards and critical minerals agreements. So this isn't just a petition that lives out in the ether. So every time there's an official public comment period surrounding a new critical minerals agreement, we take those signatures and we submit them in that process so that trade negotiations feel a sense of accountability. And this is the easiest thing that any of us can do, and it only takes a minute. And the site, again, it's in the chat, is criticalmineralsjustice.org. Secondly, organizations are encouraged to endorse the petition as well as that online website. So if you can visit the website, you'll see that over 130 organizations across the country have already signed on. That's environmental groups, human rights groups, faith groups, indigenous and labor rights groups. And there's a link on the site where any organization you're involved with can sign on and endorse it as well. And lastly, if you're looking for a quick way to support this work, one of the most helpful things you can do is to help us amplify our new documentary and the Critical Minerals website on social media. So we've already got posts ready to go, and Clayton will be dropping links in the chat to share on X, Blue Sky, Facebook, and Instagram as well. And our posting just takes a second, but it will really help us take this issue and put it in front of more people. And it makes it harder for decision makers to keep critical minerals justice out of the spotlight. And obviously, if you sign the petition or your organization endorses the website, unless you choose to opt out, we will have your contact information and we'll contact you again about other urgent steps in the campaign. So we don't do daily or even weekly emails, so we can only contact you when there's actually an opportunity for you to make a difference and when we really need your help. So that, in a nutshell, is the issue and our asks of you. And I'm sure folks have questions or comments, and I'd love to hear as many of them as we have time for. But also, before we dive into the Q&A portion, I also want to introduce the incredible folks who are joining me for this part of the conversation. So we have Marianne Comfort, who's from the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, where she leads on environmental justice and anti-racism advocacy, and her grounding in faith-based justice work has been such a powerful perspective in this project. We also have Krista Shunnam, who is from Climate Rights International, where she works at the intersection of trade, climate, and justice. And she has a sharp analysis and clarity that were so key to this conversation and our documentary. And I also, want to give a very special thank you to Jake Conroy, our editor, who brought this film to life with so much care and so much precision, with a skill set that I do not have. And I'm deeply grateful for the way that he helped shape the visuals and just the overall feel and impact of this project. So thank you, Jake. And thank you all so much for being a part of this. It's been an honor to learn and work alongside you. Ileana and Maurice, who were in our documentary, unfortunately could not make it today, but we're also so grateful for everything that they added. So thank you all so much for being here. And without further ado, let's lead into the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mira, for walking us through what we can do in the near term and for introducing the awesome people that gave time and energy to this project. I do want to turn now to some questions. I think a really good place to start this conversation, and Mira, I'm going to pose this question, I think, first to you and then invite others to jump in. But I think a key question behind some of this work is people really feel like the climate crisis is pressing, right? It's here, it's now, it's happening as we speak. Do we really want to impose additional standards that are going to make a clean energy transition slower or more expensive? Because some of this might sound like that to someone.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a valid concern. I think it was a concern that even I had initially. You see all these new regulations coming in, and you're like, won't this make things more difficult? But making sure that workers and communities, both here in the US and around the world, actually benefit from the clean energy transition. It's not just the right thing to do, but it can also help to speed up the process. So we've all seen how strong the opposition to real climate action has been for decades. And one of the biggest talking points against it is that it'll cost jobs or raise prices. But in the US, we need workers and environmentalists standing together to push for climate solutions. And globally, we need people in the global South standing in solidarity with those in the global North to make sure that this transition is truly just. Because if the clean energy transition just ends up looking like wealthy people in the US driving Teslas, while people in the global south are stuck doing dangerous, polluting work in nickel and cobalt mines, then of course it's going to be met with resistance and it'll stay slow and as it is. And what we need is a broad cross-border, cross-sector movement, one where green jobs and indigenous rights and a just transition aren't just buzzwords, but things that are actually central to the fight. And that kind of solidarity is how we can move faster and more fairly towards a future that is livable.
I think that's super helpful. Marianne or Krista, do either one of you want to jump in on that question?
Or just super quickly, I think, whenever we're talking about minerals, I think it's also really important to reiterate that we cannot continue burning fossil fuels. So like, even having, increased standards, I mean, at a very basic minimum, we cannot continue burning fossil fuels and achieve any sort of, impacts for local communities. Um, one thing that I always like to say is that, it's incredibly important that the energy transition is fast, but also that it's fair and just, including for the communities that are at the front lines. And so you can't really do it if you're sacrificing one piece for the other. So, having an energy transition, including, making sure that these minerals are being mined and processed in a way that is safe for local communities, safe for workers, and safe for the environment is all, hand in hand.
Anything to add, Marianne?
No, I think they said it all very well.
Awesome. One question we got, Mira, that I think is a good kind of technical question. Why do you use the term critical minerals and not the framing around transition minerals?
Yeah, so it's true that actually a lot of climate rights advocates and environmental justice advocates prefer the term transition minerals instead of critical minerals because the term critical minerals can make it sound like these materials are super duper rare and that we need to do whatever it takes to get to them no matter the cost because they're labeled as critical. But in reality, while these minerals aren't found everywhere, there are different ways that we can get them, including through circularity. And even places in the US, if we prioritize circular systems more, we need way less new mining. But that said, in this video and across our campaigns, we're using the term critical minerals because that's what government officials and trade negotiators are using right now. And we just want to be super clear about what we're talking about as we're trying to influence these same policies that we're working on. But I totally get why so many people prefer transition minerals to critical minerals. And if that term feels more accurate or more values driven to you, please feel free to use it.
Krista or Marianne, anything to add on that question?
I guess the only thing I would say is we're being very careful and shifting to using transition minerals. And the main reason being is we're finding that the term critical minerals is also being used for to cover military and other security purposes. And so, as faith groups also really have a peace and nonviolence component to our work. We really want to make sure that when we're talking about minerals for the energy transition, that's what they're being used for. And it's not used as cover for also expanding militarism and, mining for those purposes.
Anything to add, Krista?
No, that's all great.
Awesome. This is actually a great question. And I'll kind of pose it openly to anybody who wants to answer it. What does an effective role for civil society look like in this space?
I'm happy to take a first go at it and then maybe pass to my other panelists. I mean, I think that there's just so many different types of civil society groups and organizations that there's kind of a role for everyone. So when you're looking at local organizations and community organizations at the very most local level that are working to organize communities, spread information and educate people about what projects are, what their rights, communities' rights are, and what steps they can do to get more information from government actors and companies. Like that's an absolute key role. There's also a role for national and capital-based organizations of engaging with their governments to make sure there are strong laws and regulations on the books to protect communities and protect the environment. One thing that folks might have just seen is, in the US, the Department of Interior has just announced it's going to accelerate all critical mineral mining project permitting to 28 days. So these are projects that typically would go through multiple years of permitting. This will likely get challenged, but you can imagine the role for many different organizations like this. It could be bringing legal cases, it could be doing public education. So really it's, if your organization is interested in a specific thing of using the skills, the experience that you have to really engage on these issues in, whatever way fits best for your organization.
Yeah, I guess I would separate out when we're talking about mining in the US and the role of civil society, and then when we're talking about the critical mineral agreements or trade agreements. Because in the US, we're seeing a lot of appetite of members of Congress to loosen regulations so that there's more mining on public lands. And so there's a lot of space and need for civil society, both groups and individuals, to weigh in on opposing laws that are legislation that's moving through Congress now, like the Mineral Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, which would grant a lot more expansive uses of mining companies on public lands. So that would be the domestic side. Internationally, I think those of us who are part of organizations that have both domestic and international partners, there's an opportunity when there are these trade agreements or critical mineral agreements coming through to make sure there's pressure on both sides. So we have heard when we've been in conversations with folks in the previous administration, how important it is to have the trading partners, people in the countries of the trading partners also calling for safeguards in agreements so that that's kind of aligned priorities on both sides of the negotiating table.
Yeah. I might also add that I think, just echoing what Marianne and Krista have said, is that the role civil society plays, in addition to putting pressure, is also really shaping the narrative. So answering the questions that people have. For example, a question that I had and a question that we just talked about was, are you trying to stop the green energy transition? And it's not that, but we don't want to create another crisis of natural resources. We don't want to create a human rights crisis. So we're trying to see how we can do that justly and sustainably. So learning about it and presenting these alternatives is really important for lawmakers to know. So it's really altering the status quo via knowledge and sharing that perspective with other people as well. So building that awareness and creating those coalitions around this new idea of what an energy transition can look like.
Those are super helpful answers. Jake, I have a question for you from a close friend of the trade justice movement that is familiar with your work. This person says, I know you have a history of editing cool activist videos like this one. What are some of the coolest uses of videos that you've seen before? Do you have suggestions for how people can get the word out about this using this video?
Yeah, great question. I think video is really important. I think things like video, social media, so on and so on, allows people from other sides of the world, of the global north, to see what's happening in the global south. That 10, 20 years ago, a lot of us had no opportunities to do so, and were maybe not have been really aware of those situations in these issues. So I think we've seen video transform entire social justice movements, right? Videos have changed the course of organizations and movements, and the direction that they are going in, and really boost them into the forefront, whether that's in the media or society. Video has the opportunity to shock people, and make people and educate people, and make people move into action, which is ultimately what I think we need in order to to win these fights, these really important fights. We need people to take action. And I think one of the things that we've talked about tonight is to share this video. The video was eye-opening for myself as someone that wasn't like super, involved in this issue. And I learned a whole lot about it just from like watching the 10 minutes and getting to edit it. So I'm certainly appreciative of that opportunity. And I think that the interviews and the information in this video can go a really long way with educating people about an issue that I think a lot of people in the global north just unfortunately aren't thinking about. So yeah, share.
Thank you so much, Jay. A lot of interest and curiosity in the Q&A around circularity. A few, different threads I'm hoping folks might be able to jump in on. Are there examples of specific policies that you've seen be successful in circularity or that you would like to see be successful in circularity? Do you have a sense of what percent of renewable energy manufacturing could potentially be met using recycled materials? Assuming that we could capture all the different kinds, right, of recyclable materials. Yeah, I think those are the two good places to start. I'm going to keep scrolling through to see if there are others, but Krista, Marianne, anybody want to take a jump on either one of those?
Sure. I'm happy to plug a report that came out last year by RMI. It's called the Battery Loop. And it essentially finds that with, like effective policies around things like having, the down using, reusing, recycling of materials, EV batteries, and using them in different ways, of having smarter designed cities, of not replacing every single, internal combustion engine vehicle with an EV. And also, the size of these vehicles matter. If you're driving an EV Hummer versus, a small sedan, that those are a lot, it uses a lot more battery or a lot more minerals to produce that. And so, with proper effective policies, there are pathways to essentially need no new mining for transition minerals by 2050. And so there are like absolutely pathways to get there. Within the European Union, as part of their slate for their Green New Deal, the batteries regulation has mandates of, the percentage of recycling. With this, is also the caveat that recycling can be incredibly dangerous, particularly to workers. So it's important that recycling factories and facilities are also meeting these same standards around environmental protections and labor rights. But it is absolutely like possible to have no new mining mid-century with a lot of progressive policy making.
Very helpful. Really quick, Krista, do you have a sense of if this, I don't know exactly how to phrase this, if circularity itself would be cheaper or cheaper than mining? Like, is recycling them more cost effective? Or is that not
Yeah, I mean,
people are going?
yeah, right now we're still in the stage of like the first generation of electric vehicles where there isn't really like full recycling capacity set up because these like first generation EVs haven't really come to the end of their life. And so it is like very important that companies and governments are investing in this so that we're not coming to a place where all of a sudden in 5 or 10 years there's all these EVs coming off the road and have actually no infrastructure to develop and to process those minerals. Um, there's international kind of legal conventions governing the shipment of hazardous waste, including the Basel Convention, and so ensuring that those international rules are updated to reflect the types of toxic chemicals that could be in EV batteries is also quite important.
Thank you so much, Krista. A lot of questions coming in. So one that I think I will throw to you, Mira, is what countries is the U.S. actively negotiating critical minerals agreements with right now?
Yeah. So earlier this year, after the Trump administration ramped up tariffs, about 75 different countries have reached out to explore US trade negotiations, but not all of these will involve critical minerals talks, but still many of them will. The three that we highlighted in our documentary are some of the clearest examples, which are Argentina and the Democratic Republic of Congo as well as Indonesia. So Argentina has major lithium reserves, and the DRC is rich in cobalt, tin, and lithium, which are resources that the US is actively seeking at this time. Indonesia is another key player, as I said, so it supplies a significant portion of the world's nickel, and has also shown strong interest in forming a CMA with the US. And those are just a few examples. There are many more countries involved in ongoing discussions, and we're trying to keep a close watch on how these conversations are developing.
Helpful. Thank you so much. This is a great question that also came up. We had a call a week or so ago with Ileana Paul, who was on the video from the Sierra Club. And I'm going to pose the same question to you all that was posed to her because it came up again. We're currently in trade negotiations with Mexico and Canada over a renegotiated version of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the original NAFTA. Krista, Marianne, Mira, do any of you have a sense of how minerals related stuff might come up, especially with Mexico? I assume it's also coming up with Canada, but really curious about any intel you might have about how that might be coming up with Mexico and the USMCA. Okay.
Yeah.
Take a
I
try at
know
it.
that. Oh, okay. I could take a shot at Krista. Did you want to? Okay. Yeah, so the USMCA is a huge thing right now because there's ongoing negotiations. So any sort of way we want to get our foot in the door is really important to do right now before it's locked in for another 16 years. And I know right now the US is really focused on making sure that supply chains for EVs are secure. And I know that also involves conversations with Mexico and also pressuring ways to source minerals in manufacturing in North America. I know that Mexico does have some lithium, and I think its government has nationalized the resource, which means that it wants to take control over how it's extracted and used. So the US is definitely eyeing Mexico right now as a potential partner in securing mineral supply chains. So as I said, the USMCA negotiations are ongoing. So any sort of way we want to talk about how that policy is developed should be happening now. So important to put pressure on lawmakers before the negotiations end, probably later this year.
Maybe Hillary, just quickly, to go back maybe to the previous question a little bit on how the Trump administration is maybe looking at some of these specific mineral agreements that are a little bit different than what was happening under the Biden administration. I think the two most prominent, minerals agreements right now that are in the works are one with Ukraine and one with the DRC. And really, these are in many ways, an exchange of minerals for military aid, and that's something that is pretty unprecedented, both in the case of Ukraine and in the DRC versus the types of CMAs that were under negotiation under the Biden administration were much more specific to just the exchange of minerals. So it's absolutely concerning to put military aid as contingent on 50% of countries' mineral wealth.
Do you have any sense of it's literally just like if we're going to continue supporting Ukraine, then they're going to give us critical minerals? Is it literally like that?
I haven't read the full text of it, and there might even be people who are, listening in the audience that know much more about this than me, I'm sure. But my understanding of it is that a big piece of it requires Ukraine to invest in new mines, essentially, and new mineral resources. It's not limited to only mines; it also includes new fossil fuel resources. But currently, projects that are already underway would not kind of qualify this. So it requires the building out of new energy projects more or less to speak. And so it's not necessarily a contingency of military exchange for these mineral wealths, but in order to then getting the benefits from these future minerals projects, you would need that country to continue to exist and be having sovereignty over those areas.
Thank you for sharing that. I get asked about that a lot right now when I like go to tabling events or that kind of thing. People are always asking about that. So appreciate your insight. This is actually also a pretty good question. If countries like the US or the EU impose tougher environmental standards, won't companies just outsource more mining to nations that have weaker regulations, or essentially just shift the problem somewhere else instead of actually solving the problem? Krista, I might throw that one to you to start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, that's a huge concern always, is you don't want to like export harms to places where there are weaker and lower standards. One key piece is, minerals are where they are. There's some minerals that just occur a few places on the Earth's crust. And so, geopolitics aside, you can't get cobalt everywhere on earth. It's going to only be in a few places. I think a really key piece of to be asking, whether it's US companies, European companies, Chinese companies, is to make sure that they are following international best practices and international standards regarding environmental standards, labor rights standards, regardless of the host country's standards. So if the host country says you don't need to monitor water quality, we should be expecting companies to be doing that anyways at an international standard. So, even if these mines are happening in a place where there's a lower regulatory requirement, that doesn't necessarily mean that those companies should, be free to, engage in abusive behavior.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this directly answers the question, but I appreciate what Krista just said. But I also want to point out that there are in the investor community, the whole aspect of shareholder advocacy. So there's a whole network of values-based, faith-based investors that explicitly, in some instances, buy just enough shares in companies so they can be pressing them on these issues. So that's one way of, I know that we've had instances where we have sisters located very concerned about particular behaviors, practices of companies, and been able to go in as shareholders and really make known the concerns, engage in conversation, and some instances even have the companies meet with communities that are raising complaints. So there are ways to, have some level of conversation with companies to try to improve their practices in some ways.
Yeah. Oh, I think another thing is that that's it's totally a risk, and that's something that we're always concerned about. And that's also another reason why we're pushing for binding standards and enforcement mechanisms, as well as throughout the entire supply chain. So it's not just about when it gets to the US and making sure that things are fair once they're here, but also supporting and lifting people up globally with strong enforcement mechanisms and facility specific and facility level penalties, so that companies can't or feel less incentivized to look around for loopholes, because we're not trying to shift the harm, we're trying to reduce it everywhere.
Those are great answers. Appreciate that. I have a question here that I actually might call. I know that Trade Justice's Executive Director, Arthur, is also on in case we get any fun questions like this. Arthur, I'm going to ask you maybe to answer this question. Under Trump, will draft bilateral trade agreements be publicly disclosed before they're agreed to? Or in other words, is there some other way that we're going to be able to influence these negotiations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We do not know the answer to that question yet. And I think it's going to require a lot of advocacy to make sure that the public, environmental advocates, human rights advocates, indigenous rights advocates, get to see the terms of these agreements before they're inked and finalized. The action tools that Mira mentioned are a great starting place. There are others, tradejusticeedfund.org. But now is really the time for people to be talking to their policymakers and really demanding that there be a public oversight rule over all these various trade deals, including critical minerals agreements, because I think the real danger is if they are negotiated in the shadows, and it's really just companies and billionaire advisors advising on what the terms should be. None of the terms discussed in the video or that Mira and others have been raising are going to be in there. We really need to force it.
A real quick sort of in-jest follow-up question. Arthur, do you suspect that we'll get draft leak text for these trade deals over Signal or not?
If there are any reporters who get sent the text of these by accident, please send them to us. We'll publish them if your publication will not.
Thanks, Arthur. I think we're going to leave Q&A there. I want to thank folks for all of the amazing questions. We have 20-something questions in the Q&A. Oh, did you want to jump in, Marian? Sorry about that.
If I could just say one thing, I feel I'd be really remiss as somebody who works for an order of Catholic sisters not to give a tip of the hat to Pope Francis. Pope Francis has had a lot to say on these issues. In his teaching that came out 10 years ago, he's very clear that this isn't just a technical issue where we can't be arguing over the technicalities only, that there's a lot of, we need to be looking at the spiritual underpinnings of these issues, just like as Indigenous leaders are teaching us as well, and looking at our own lifestyles, in addition to the these technical details that we're all talking about. So just wanted to make sure we didn't forget our dear Pope Francis as we're talking about these issues.
I think that's an excellent note. I wanted to actually have a little bit of a closeout comments moment. So I want to give maybe 30 seconds would be a good amount of time, but I want to invite you, Mira, Marianne, Krista, Jake, Arthur, if you want, to just give us 30 seconds of anything that we didn't talk about, that you wanted to be sure that you said, or anything that you really just want to close out our conversation with. Who wants to start?
I can jump in, just building on just what I said. I think one of the things that we in the faith community who are following these issues are really starting to look at is, what does post-extractivism look like? We're saying, what we're against a lot, but what can we be really articulating is, what is the world that doesn't depend on extracting of natural resources and the exploitation of communities look like? So really looking forward to engaging in a lot of people in those conversations.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Krista. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to go next. I want to say I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Our panelists and everyone in the audience watching on Zoom, working on this film and learning from our incredible speakers and getting to share it with all of you has been a very, very meaningful experience. And it's been one of the most powerful opportunities that I've had so far. And to be trusted with an issue like this and be able to speak on it, something that impacts people's lives every day, means a lot to me. And I'm really grateful to everyone who helps make that happen. And I am excited to keep the momentum going and keep pushing for a just and sustainable future. And all of you being here was the first step. So thank you.
Yeah, I think two things. First of all, I'd just like to share that 54% of all transition mineral mining projects are on Indigenous peoples' lands and customary territories. And so it's absolutely critical that in all of these projects, Indigenous peoples are able to exercise their right to free, prior, and informed consent, the ability to have information about a project before it goes forward, and ultimately to decide yes or no whether those projects do move forward on Indigenous lands. And then secondly, we think of a lot of, environmental issues, including climate change, as an environmental issue. And I just really invite you to also make sure that you're centering people in when you're thinking about these projects. And so, climate change is absolutely a human rights issue in the same way that these mining projects also have impacts on people and human rights.
Seems wrong to leave this to the editor of the video, but I will say that I think sometimes these issues feel really overwhelming, or that they're happening halfway around the world, or, in this case, it's their cell phone, it's everything. But I really don't think that we should underestimate people power and the power that we have as communities, even if small communities in our neighborhoods, or, our towns that we live in. We have the ability to make big change for people, and the planet all around the world. So I think it's really important to figure out ways that you figure out issues that you feel really passionately about, and figure out ways to plug into those movements to make change. And sometimes it might feel overwhelming or scary, but something as simple as coming to something like this tonight, sharing a video, having a conversation, signing a petition, joining an organization on social media, we're getting out there and signing, doing letter writing, or even something like a protest, is all really important. And when we all work together in our small communities, that adds up to really big change. So I appreciate all the work you're doing. I'm excited to see where you all go next.
Thank you so much for all of those last words and final comments. I would love if we could get some hearts and some clapping hands, or whatever other little reactions folks have for our speakers, and for Mira um, for her work on this documentary project. We're really grateful to all of you. Um, so for me, I want to just say that I really see this as a starting point. Like Mira said, it's a place where we can do even more good work on critical minerals. We appreciate all the folks on this call for the things they've already done. And I want to note quickly that folks are going to be getting a follow-up email from me likely tomorrow at this point, with all the different resources that we discussed here, a link to the documentary, links to the social media posts to share. As we've discussed tonight, the Trump administration is absolutely thinking about critical minerals procurement as it moves forward with all these new trade policy plans that we're seeing kind of play out before our eyes day after day, moment by moment. And I do expect to see some of those deals that they're working on include critical minerals. So please be on the lookout for additional resources and asks in the coming weeks and months, because this campaign is going to keep moving. With that, I want to give one final thank you to all of our speakers, to Mira, to co-hosts from the California Trade Justice Coalition and Global Exchange. Thanks so much for attending, folks, and I'll be in touch soon. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.